All right, well, let's move on to talk about Lukaku. Romelu Lukaku's latest quotes about his current situation at Chelsea. Now, it must be said, these were a few weeks ago, and they were said to Sky Sport Italia. Physically, I'm fine, he says, but I'm not happy with the situation at Chelsea. Tuchel has chosen to play with another system. I won't give up, I'll be professional. I am not happy with the situation, but I am professional, and I can't give up now. Gab Marcotti is joining us now to talk more about this. This is Romelu Lukaku also on returning to Inter from the same interview. Said, I've always said that I have Inter in my heart. I know I'll return to Inter. I really hope from the bottom of my heart to return to Inter. Not at the end of my career, but when I'm still at a top level to win more together. Now, given the situation that's going on at Chelsea at the moment, you can understand why there's been a bit of upset. So, Gab, first of all, the translation is accurate from what Lukaku said, right?
So this is part of a longer interview. They've only aired clips of it. The translation is accurate, but I think if you look at the context of it and the way it sounds in Italian, which is what he was speaking, it comes across a little bit different. It comes across as somebody who, had been back fit for a number of games, hadn't started any Premier League games since his return, and he's basically saying, look, I'm not getting into the side. The coach is playing a different system. I'm not happy with it. I want to start. I'm going to keep being professional and working harder. I genuinely don't think he meant anything more than that. And certainly not, if this is going to be your next question, whether he's trying to engineer some kind of return to Inter, because I think he knows very well what the situation is at Inter, and that right now that's entirely untenable.
But a Chelsea fan doesn't want to hear that, surely, from Romelu Lukaku about this player wanting to return to Inter. Not right now, anyway.
But he was out the team with injury. Then he had a COVID, and he was infected with COVID. He had the protocols of that. I'm not 100% sure what he's talking about with systems, because it's been pretty much playing the same way, but you had different personnel in there. I thought it was more of a case of Tuchel protecting Lukaku a little bit in terms of the long season, the injury, had him on the bench. So I don't quite know the system scenario, what he was talking about, because Thomas Tuchel's pretty much played the same way since he's been at Chelsea.
It's kind of brainless, isn't it? It's some really brainless things to say.
But he's spoken about him positively since, but does it matter when these quotes came out?
Oh, listen, whenever you get pulled up when you've slaughtered somebody, then you will start to spin it the other way and say, well, I didn't mean that. He's basically criticised the manager, saying that what he told him's not true. He doesn't like the way they play. I mean, who says that to the manager? And by the way, my heart is still in Inter. That's exactly, as you said, what the fans want to hear. I mean, it's kind of brainless comments, isn't it?
If you're a Chelsea fan, no, it's not what you want to hear. But in all honesty, as I read that, that's exactly what I thought. But Gab put it into a different context, I think paints a slightly different picture that you have to appreciate. But knowing the British media, particularly the tabloid media, they are going to go to town with this, and all of a sudden Romelu Lukaku is going to have to be defending.
He's not 18, Shaka.
Right? No. Yes, but he's doing an interview in Italian with an Italian newspaper, and you take snippets out of it. And it makes good tabloid fodder, and that's what it is.
Well, we can't blame the media for this one, Shaka. I think that there's something lost in translation here. I mean, that is the way you kind of talk and everything. But this is not to show loyalty to Chelsea Football Club. And yes, this could be made a couple of 3 weeks ago, and maybe they have talked it out later, and he's back in the team and he's doing a job for his team again. But Sky Italy will never put this on without his acceptance. So I don't like this. I think that is a stupid thing to say, and I don't think that's what you should say in a lot of games coming up. No, Chelsea's struggling a bit. It's not what they need, and I think the loyalty has to go both ways, not only from club to player, also from player to club sometimes.
Gab?
I mean, look, I don't think we can have it both ways. I don't think we can have a situation where we want players to be honest and not give bland post-match quotes and bland interviews, or whether you want people to be honest. If I were a Chelsea fan, I wouldn't want Lukaku to say, oh, look, I'm back from injury, I'm training, I'm working hard. I always come off the bench because he plays other guys, but I'm happy with that. That's fine because I get paid a ton of money. Now, of course, he's not going to be happy with the situation. You're right. The translation, the word he used in Italian, you can translate as system. You can also translate it as setup. Maybe he was referring to the personnel. Needless to say, Italian isn't his mother tongue either. But I think even people who don't like Lukaku would tend to agree that whatever else he is, he's not stupid. This is a very, very bright guy. And when somebody goes and does something like this, you have to ask yourself, is he being devious? Is he trying to engineer something? And there is no way Inter can afford him. There is no way he's going back to Inter. It's just not happening. It's certainly not happening now. He's talking about some point in the future he'd love to go back because he had a great time in Milan. But he knows it's not going to be now because the club don't have any money. So certainly that's how I read it. I read it just saying, look, I'm not getting in the team. I obviously have to convince Tuchel to let me start from the beginning. Maybe he thinks I get injured. Maybe whatever his reasons are. Maybe he likes Werner and Havertz better. I got to get back in there. And, you know, the game he started against Brighton, that was his first Premier League start since the beginning of October.
So, listen, there's two things, Gab. He's clearly not as bright as you think he is. And the other point, and the most important point is, it's not a footballer's job to be honest with the press. It's a footballer's job to do his job to the best of his ability, his loyalty to the club, and not to say anything stupid that the reporters and analysts and media and people like us can jump on and give him grief over. It's not his job to be honest.
How is it stupid? How is it stupid to say, I'm working hard, I want to get them, I'm not happy with not playing?
How is it not stupid?
Did you like it when your player said, oh, look, Nicol's not putting me in the team, but that's okay, I'm delighted. I love sitting on the bench and collecting my paycheck. Is that what you wanted?
That's not what he said. That's not what he said.
I tell you what.
He criticised the system for a start and then said that what Tuchel told him he wasn't telling the truth. That's completely different than somebody complaining about not playing.
How long I tell you what is stupid, right? And I admire everybody who has honesty. However, when you're brought in for the fee that he has been brought in, right, to be not his words but you know, quote unquote, the guy that's going to make the difference between Chelsea winning the league potentially or not. He is one of the final pieces of the jigsaw. A successful guy, an experienced international footballer who's just signed big bucks for this club, less than 6 months into a contract, and he's talking about potentially going back to play in Italy for Inter. And not when he's finished playing, but when he's in his prime. Well, he's 28.
But
he's only going to be in his prime a year or two down the line. So I mean, I think it's silly.
I would just want to say that we can sit in different places around the world, and if he's stupid or not stupid, if his comments are stupid or not comment. But what I will say, Gab, I think that the timing of it is dreadful. I mean, it's a time when Chelsea is struggling, and you may say that he did that 2-3 weeks ago, but there is no way Lukaku would have not accepted that it comes on now. That is point one. I spoke to a Belgian friend of mine who is a journalist who follows Lukaku, and I said, what's your take on this? And he said, he talks too much. And I think that is just, and that I agree with Stevie Nicol. Why should he talk now? Why don't he just shut up and score goals? And I'm not saying that. Yeah, and I'm not saying that, Gab, in a disrespect to a player, but because we don't want boring players. But I think his timing on this statement was terrible.
And all he's done here is pile more pressure on himself, because what happens now is...
I agree with you there, Craig. All I would say is it's a half-hour interview. We've seen 3 minutes and 11 seconds of it. The rest of it airs tomorrow here in Europe. I kind of want to see what the broader context is before I go and I make up my mind about what Lukaku was or wasn't trying to do, whether he was being stupid or whether he was being devious. And Jan, as far as this interview airing without Lukaku's permission or Lukaku's agent's permission, I wouldn't be entirely sure that that's the case. I know we at ESPN as a network, we don't grant copy approval to people we interview. I certainly don't give copy approval, and I'm pretty sure Sky Italia wouldn't either in this situation.
But Gab, if you if you had a go at your boss at ESPN, I mean, you would have thought of it, when shall I do it? Because we footballers, they can just talk about their bosses like they want, can't they? So we can't really compare with an ESPN employee.
I don't understand why we keep repeating he's having a go at Tuchel. Did he say Tuchel's weird looking, Tuchel's bad, Tuchel plays bad football?
Was this a good comment for Tuchel?
From what I saw, he didn't say that. He simply said, Tuchel's gone with a different setup, which I take to mean he's playing different players and he's not playing me, and I got to go and change his mind. I got to work harder and be professional.
Do you think Tuchel comes into the dressing room tomorrow and says, yes, we have 7 COVID, we have 8 injuries. Thank you, Lukaku, for taking off the pressure of them. Do you think he like it?
I could care less what Tuchel likes or not, but what he said 2 weeks ago before the injuries was the fact that he wasn't playing. They said, hey, look, you're the most expensive player in the club's history. You're not getting a game. And he says, are you okay with that? And he says, no, I'm not happy with the situation. I'm not starting. He's making different choices. I got to go convince him to put me back into the side. That's how I understood it. Again, when we see the rest of the interview, maybe the context will be different.
Well, I think it's important that we do get that context. We have to get that context to Gab's point, because we've all been misquoted by
He's
the
not
tabloid
been
media.
misquoted.
Well, for instance, without the context,
I want to go back to Inter.
I'll give an example.
It's not a misquote.
I'll give an example from my own playing days. When I was at Newcastle, Les Ferdinand was asked, when we signed Tino Asprilla, he was asked by a journalist, did Kevin Keegan seek your opinion before signing Tino Asprilla? And he said no. He doesn't have to. He's the manager. Headline in the tabloid media, Kevin Keegan did not seek my approval. My approval to sign Tino Asprilla. That's exactly what he said. That, to the tabloid media, that is exactly what he said. But without the context, it is far more egregious than what actually happened in that interview. So my point is, whether he's misquoted or not, without the context, the tabloid media, and we all know it, we've all been victims of it, the tabloid media can turn this to any story that they want.
Hold on, but I don't think you can...
victim of saying maybe something wrong that was taken, not 2 and 3 different...
I don't think you can talk about going back to...
There's 3 different things in there that should not have been said. 3, not just one thing.
But to Gab's point, if he says no, Tuchel's gone with a different system and the team's winning, and I'm not playing, I'm not happy, I'm not playing, but it is what it is at this point. All I'm saying is, if that is the context that he delivered this, now I don't speak Italian, Romelu Lukaku's first language is in Italian, but if that is the gist that he's trying to get across, then if they put that Tuchel's gone with a different system and are not happy, while that may not be strictly misquoting him, it is totally against
Jack,
what he's trying to make.
I don't think look, everybody's going to survive this, right?
Right, yeah, no question.
It's not life or death.
Yes.
However, I don't think that's the problematic little piece that's been taken out. I think it's the talk about going back to Italy. Because what we have, and even if he says, well, it's in 3 years, 4 years, whatever it is, but, the problem is Chelsea are in a rut. At the moment, they're falling off the pace. They've got Liverpool and City coming up, and Tottenham in the League Cup, 2 games, and then Brighton away. It's a tough run, right?
Yeah.
Now, what he has done at a time when Tuchel needs everybody on board, he's put it out there that actually, quite fancy being somewhere else. Now, he's made a rod for his own back, because if they struggle and he doesn't score goals, there's going to be 40,000 Chelsea fans plus who couldn't give a hoot about the context of an interview.
Agreed, but... And not that I'm Romelu Lukaku's defence lawyer, and he certainly doesn't need me to defend him. But if the question is from a journalist, wouldn't you love to come back to Italy? And he's like, yeah, I loved it here. Inter was great. Again, as much as you take it and spread it in tabloid media.
But
it's all
simple answer. You know what? One day I would love to go back, yes.
All I'm saying is, we've all done innocent interviews like that has been spun out of all proportion.
Anyway, he's put himself under more pressure.
And that's fine.
And obviously, his club Chelsea are under pressure at the moment.
Well, thank you very much for watching ESPN on YouTube. For more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for live streaming, premium content, and let's not forget as well, ESPN FC 7 days a week. Subscribe to ESPN Plus.